Thank you. Good morning, Doug. Good morning in the interpretation booth. Hi, good morning. My name is Jay Cope, for those who may not know me. Could we turn off the music in the background, please? Thank you. On behalf of Luigi Einaudi, he and I are both fellows at the Institute for National Strategic Studies Center for Strategic Research. We would like to welcome you, and we would also like to welcome you on behalf of our co-sponsors. Our co-sponsors are the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, also a part of NDU, the Inter-American Dialogue, the Inter-American Defense Board, which this may be the first time that the Inter-American Defense Board has ever co-sponsored an event, and we're very pleased that they're with us and to be working with them. We're also very pleased again to have Southern Command, and last but not least, and certainly not least, is the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. And for those of you who may not know, this being the 15th annual Western Hemisphere Security Colloquium, the one organization that has either organized or co-sponsored every one is the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. And it's a symbol of their commitment to better understanding our security challenge and to foster ideas about how to deal with it. So again, we are very pleased to be working with Doug Lovelace and Max Manwaring and others from the Army War College. A couple admin things. NDU wants us to make sure that everyone knows that you can't take drinks and food into this auditorium. We're trying to keep it in a pristine manner, and so far we're doing pretty well. And so if you would bear with us on that, please enjoy them outside. For those who know my bagel policy, we try to go for 0 bagels at the end of a day of an event. We got smaller bagels today to try to stretch it. We have a large number of people who have signed up to attend and will be here during the course of the day, I'm sure, but would appreciate your help in eliminating those. The restrooms that you may have seen are just in the hallway behind me. Cell phones do not work well in this room, and so we would ask you, please, to either turn it off or put it on stun or something. The building doesn't deal with cell phones very well, so if you need to make a call, I would suggest that you get as close to a window or a door as possible, because that's generally where the reception is fairly good. For those of you that will be using interpretation, the channel is numero dos, number 2, and we have 2 intrepid interpreters in the back, the Aragon ladies, who have worked with me on many occasions, and they are just wonderful, and we're very pleased that they could be with us. I do have a mechanism to try to gather everyone when we need to. This is Cope's unique cowbell. So I will be around with a cowbell when it is time to regather. It's worked in times past, and we'll give it another shot. We're going to change location for lunch. We will move from this auditorium down the length of Lincoln Hall and over through a little covered passageway over into Marshall Hall. And one of the multi-purpose rooms at the south end of Marshall Hall is where we will have lunch and where our luncheon speakers will engage us. On your way there, you will see, we You Canadians, we just made every effort to get something for you. At the south end of this building, in our atrium there, we have the special collection of the NDU Library has put on a display of all of our holdings from to celebrate the bicentennial of the War of 1812 and the Star-Spangled Banner. So I have to get this in before Claypack gets up here and says something, because I know he's going to. But it's very nicely done, and invite to quickly take a look at it. In Marshall Hall, there you will find some literature like you had here that is free. Please, if you're interested, please take some. There is also the NDU Foundation's store. Unfortunately, that is not free, but there may be some memorabilia there that you might like to purchase. They'll be happy to sell it to you. We do have a reception tonight. If you had not noticed that on your program, the agenda, the Inter-American Defense College has kindly invited, that is not the college, the Inter-American Defense Board and the Council of Delegates at the board have invited us to a reception at the Casa del Soldado up on 16th Street. For those of you who do not have a vehicle, we have arranged, thanks to the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, we have arranged for 3 15-passenger vans, which will be spotted immediately out in front of the auditorium after we are finished today, that will take people to the Casa. And those of you who are driving, there are maps that are available as to how to get there. And it is not a difficult trip, it's fairly straightforward. But given the traffic, it'll take a little bit. So that starts about 17:45. We should be finished a little before 5. There is parking at the Casa or in their fairly large parking lot, and if not, there's some side streets that can take parking that usually this time of day are not very crowded. So we hope that you can join us there. A word or two just to set the stage. We're at a colloquium that is the culmination of a study which Ambassador Einaudi and I are doing for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Western Hemisphere Affairs, and the Joint Staff J5, America's Division. It's a study of the same name as this particular event. We felt, all of us, our customers and Ambassador Einaudi and myself, that there was a real need for some new, innovative thinking at the strategic and operational levels about how to engage security issues in this hemisphere. We, in thinking about this, came up with 5 themes, which are the panels that you will engage today and tomorrow. In the organization, I put down, in addition to the paper writers who are specifically addressing one of those 5 themes, I put down, probably a bad term, case studies. And essentially what I meant by that is that these are cases that relate to that particular theme. And the individuals who will make presentations on those cases really have done a little bit of work studying it, so it seemed like a logical name. And so on that panel, we have a package of ideas having to do with those 5 themes that we hope to draw upon in concluding our study. It starts at the more strategic level and then gets much more specific by the 5th panel as we get into actual defense tools that we need to think about using and how they are being used in the new environment in which we face. We are coming up on the 10th anniversary of the Declaration of Security for the Americas. That provided for us a good a good point to take a look at just where we are, how much has changed, how much hasn't changed, and in dealing with both, which can be good and not good, we are interested in finding ways to move forward, to rethink, to better address what it is that we are trying to do in the hemisphere. And then hopefully we will get that published in English and Spanish, and hopefully maybe even Portuguese, and make that available before the Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, and hopefully have a document that can be considered by the participants that will be at that meeting in late October, early November. Okay, without further ado, that's a little bit of background as to just why we're here. We are very pleased to kick off our event today by the presence of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Frank Mora. Frank is no stranger to the National Defense University, having been a professor here for a few years. He does know his way around this turf, but he has also been a tremendous supporter for the Western Hemisphere program at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, having spoken here at a number of occasions. But he is a very interesting person for all of us to get a better sense of just how the Department of Defense is looking at issues in this hemisphere. That is a topic that is rather current. For those of you who may not know it, the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, was just completed a visit to 3 countries, Colombia, Brazil, and Chile, at the end of April. There is an op-ed piece by the Secretary that was published on the 13th of May in the Miami Herald, and it is out here on the table. Very interesting piece to see how he sees the region and how it has changed. It's a very good piece. And there have been a number of other events that have been taking place that are not in the press, not in the media, are not visible, but all kinds of bilateral working groups and conferences with other countries that have taken place, sponsored or participated in heavily by Frank's office. So let me invite him to the stage, and as we will everyone, there's a bio in your book for everyone, so I'm not going into great detail as to just what people's backgrounds are, but we would invite Frank to come up and launch our conference. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Jay. Let me start real quickly before I get the cowbell. I promise that I will be as brief as possible. Jay, I want to thank you and Luigi again for organizing this conference on the near anniversary of that meeting in Mexico City. And you have really put together an impressive lineup of scholars, analysts, and others that are more expert than I on many of these issues. As you indicated, Jay, the Secretary was in South America a few weeks ago, and he was there to articulate. One of the reasons he was there is to articulate and share with his counterparts the January document, the new Strategic Defense Guidance, where all the key elements are laid out in the op-ed that Jay mentioned. And one of the things that the document mentions, and it's reiterated, he said so in his speech in Brazil, and that Jay referred to, is the word innovative, and being creative as to how we go about establishing new partnerships and new alliances. And so I want to spend the next few minutes laying some of this out in greater detail than perhaps is explained or offered in the op-ed. but that are, I think, in many ways consistent with the themes and the concepts that many of you will be discussing over the next day or so. So thank you again, Jay, for this opportunity. Now, as I think many of you know, I've spoken before about the realities of the 21st century defense and security challenge and the choices that we are making and must make in order to move forward on a very complex set of challenges and environment. The reality is that defense relationships have come a long way since that 2003 meeting in Mexico City. And as the Secretary commented following his recent trip to South America, a remarkable transformation is taking place in the Western Hemisphere. We are seeing some very, very positive trends, and to be honest, some disconcerting trends that I could and will raise in a second. So we've entered, as I mentioned, a new era for defense and security partnerships in the Americas. One that requires, and I've mentioned this before, a vision for the future of our armed forces and agreement on what defense practices and norms are needed to confront the very complex challenges of the 21st century. Let me start by providing my view of the current inter-American defense system and its institutional underpinnings, and then discuss what it means and what it doesn't mean as we move forward, with our frame being the defense strategic guidance that released by President Obama and Secretary Pineda in January of this year. Now, first, the system. The Secretary, during his trip and in the op-ed, provided specific examples that led him to believe that an important transformation and important opportunities are emerging in the region. Chief among them was the realization that countries like Brazil, Colombia, Chile, the three countries that he visited, but also, I would add to the list, El Salvador, have all become security exporting countries. That is, that these countries and others are doing more than they ever have in contributing to global security and advancing peace and security in the hemisphere, within and beyond their borders. When you consider these developments in conjunction with a proliferation of bilateral, sub-regional, and multilateral defense partnerships and institutions, a picture emerges, a network, a system of defense cooperation is emerging. Maybe some of you may disagree, but let me move this forward. It is in this regard that I believe that today we must think about what we mean by a mature, effective inter-American defense system. Inter-American defense system. Now, this requires us to think the very conceptual frameworks that arose from the Rio Treaty and other multilateral instruments. But such context is needed to more adequately address the needs of our time. The current system is producing actions not taken unilaterally, but collectively between countries or among countries within various sub-regions of the hemisphere. For example, countries like Colombia and Chile are finding ways to support regional security efforts in Central America. I was surprised. I just recently arrived from a week-long trip to Central America and was surprised by how much both Colombia and Chile and others are doing in the area of capacity building, for example, in Central America. So as they do much of this, where they provide bilateral support to other partners through training or the direct provision of troops and equipment within the UN missions in Haiti and elsewhere in the world. Similarly, the United States is pursuing or has concluded several defense cooperation agreements on bilateral bases, while working with sub-regional partners in Central America and the Caribbean through a process of dialogue, of collective action, intended to leverage the efforts, the resources of multiple partners to confront transnational organized crime. So bilateral, multilateral are not, or collective action are not mutually exclusive. In short, collective efforts by defense partners at the bilateral, regional, and multilateral levels is having a positive impact. And we're seeing the results of this on regional and global peace and security, and reflects the new realities of cooperation, defense cooperation in the hemisphere, and that underpin many of our policies and documents today. Now, relationships are evolving because of a necessity to act collectively, to share the burden. And because no one country, as President Obama has repeatedly said, can act alone in response to the threats and challenges of the 21st century. So that's the system. Okay, well, what about the institutions that underpin or that are emerging or evolving to support this system? If this system is strong and growing, I would argue that its foundation lies on the strength or in the strength of such institutions and that make up the former Inter-American Defense System. The collection of multilateral instruments, the multilateral defense and security institutions such as the Inter-American Defense Board and College, and for us, such as the Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas. Together with the OAS, we work through these institutions and develop formal defense partnerships to overcome resource challenges, leverage unique capabilities, and share best practices. One of the more, I think, interesting developments that we are seeing today is that the number of countries that are willing to share their experiences and their practices with countries not only in the Western Hemisphere, but really throughout the globe. Now, the environment in which these institutions and relationships are born has changed and is changing, and I would argue for the better. Now, with the exception of Cuba, governments throughout the hemisphere are civilian and democratically elected. Military institutions have become far more professional, are firmly subordinate to civilian authorities, and are among the most respected institutions according to all the data and polling that's done regularly. Interstate conflict, as you know, is not out of the question, but is increasingly unthinkable given the strength of modern, cooperative, confidence-building systems that exist today and have been growing over the last number of years. Then you look at the 2003 Declaration and other political commitments which recognize that there is a valid and beneficial role for our militaries in confronting the emerging threats of the 21st century. Leaders also recognize that the threats facing the hemisphere, as that document says, are multidimensional indeed. An acknowledgement that the solutions, therefore, to the security challenges facing the region cannot be solved by militaries, police, or civilian institutions alone, but that require a collective interagency response in addition to a multinational response. So the environment has changed. The guidance at the multi-level is clear, and I think the examples of increased cooperation across a wide spectrum of defense institutions, activities ranging from traditional exercises and the basic profession of arms to cyber defense is an important area that the Secretary talked quite a bit about during his visit to South America, as was the issue of technology transfer, which was an important issue in Brazil. And of course, we have peacekeeping. All of this demonstrates that defense institutions in the hemisphere have answered the call. So the question becomes, what role and should these institutions, military institutions, play as a foundation of the inter-American defense system of the 21st century? Now, as Secretary Panetta recently commented in both his op-ed and in his speech at the War College in Brazil, he plans to attend the next Conference of Defense Ministers in Uruguay and is urging, and did urge his counterparts during his visit, to use this forum, the CDMA, to strengthen our defense cooperation in order to meet emerging challenges throughout the hemisphere. But what does this actually mean tangibly as we move forward? Well, for starters, countries and institutions, as I mentioned, are playing an important role in fostering greater and more concrete collective action. Chile is spearheading efforts to implement the mechanism for humanitarian assistance and disaster response that was discussed at the 2010 CDMA. Brazil and other countries have proposed that the creation of a technical secretariat for the CDMA in order to provide administrative and logistical support to allow host countries to focus on the thematic proposals and commitments made by ministers. And we fully support the recommendation that the board, the Inter-American Defense Board, serve this important role. Now, speaking about the board, they too are reinventing themselves. In addition to providing demanding support, the board just last month facilitated a humanitarian assistance disaster response tabletop exercise for members and in support of Fuerzas Aliadas, an exercise that are developing more concrete activities that could support the CDMA humanitarian assistance and disaster response proposal that will be before the ministers at the 2012 meeting in Uruguay, October of this year. Beyond purely defense institutions, I believe the OAS can and must play a role in addressing the other aspects of multidimensional security. As an example, and taking into consideration the concerns that partners expressed at the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, it's appropriate that the OAS play a role in finding alternatives, solutions in the fight against illicit trafficking, especially as militaries throughout the hemisphere are being asked to become more involved in these activities. There is need for further discussion and debate about the role these multilateral defense institutions and armed forces can play in advancing citizen security. But it is clear that the system relies on such institutions as useful fora for deeper cooperation through dialogue and effective action. Now, these institutions also require our attention and strong leadership. In this regard, I think it's important to note the value of a strong national participation in these processes. And I would be remiss in failing to recognize the strong leadership of General Thibault, of Ambassador Blackwell, and others who are steering these institutions into the 21st century. We, in the Department of Defense, are working with these leaders and others throughout the hemisphere in preparation for what I think will be a very important and, dare I say, historic CDMA in Uruguay. And will support proposals at the CDMA, the board, or the OS that respond to President Obama and Secretary Panetta's guidance to us that we must focus on equal partnership. Now, this approach, working through multilateral institutions, is actually found and well established in the U.S. National Security Strategy and was, as I said recently or a few minutes ago, was most recently highlighted in the Department of Defense strategic guidance released earlier this year. This approach also reflects the evolution of the inter-American defense system and responds to the transnational nature of today's threats. The prioritization of partnership is a recognition, it's not just an altruistic approach, but it is a recognition that the cost of failing to effectively partner brings with it an unacceptable risk. As President Obama said, failure to work together will guarantee failure in dealing with the challenges of today. As we think about what has changed over the past 10 years, I'd like to share with you what this means and what it does not mean. And I want to emphasize the latter in terms of our U.S. defense policy. Now, what it means. First, what it means. Now, leaders throughout the hemisphere are employing their defense institutions in ways that were perhaps unthinkable 20, 25 years ago. These missions include countering transnational organized crime and more technological threats like cybercrime. And forces continue to support traditional missions such as peacekeeping operations and responding to humanitarian crises and natural disasters. So the number of missions and responsibilities that are being given to militaries in the region are growing with the changes and challenges that many of them face in the 21st century. Across the board, leaders from all ends of the political spectrum are instructing their military to address citizen insecurity. And here there is no correlation between ideological leanings and this tendency towards using militaries in these non-traditional roles. The non-traditional security challenges facing democracy in this hemisphere are overwhelming their capacity to respond, and leaders are relying more on militaries. For some, this could be troublesome. We in the United States do not necessarily support, nor do we encourage that militaries engage in dealing with organized crime or dealing with the crime issue in many countries. But the reality is that these governments have made a sovereign decision to deploy them in different ways to deal with citizen security. Some people are asking, what will be the effect over time if leaders do not invest in strong and lasting justice sector reform? Will we see a return to the 60s and 70s where the militaries will be the sole provider of basic services? And what is the impact on the inter-American defense system that has emerged strong at the beginning of this century? And finally, what does it mean for U.S. cooperation? I lay those questions out for you, not that necessarily I'm going to answer them all, but perhaps this could be something for you to discuss during the next day or so. As General Odierno recently published in Foreign Affairs, we will partner in the Americas where it is practical, where there is agreement, and in non-kinetic ways. DoD is committed to reinvigorating defense partnership, as I mentioned earlier, and continues to be focused on developing partnership capacity building programs, and we think such efforts have a multiplier effect throughout the system. Just to give you a couple of examples, the Massachusetts National Guard, the State Partnership Program, has played a vital role in training Paraguayan engineer companies that have served and are serving in the UN peacekeeping operation in Haiti. The first time that Paraguay has sent a military unit to a peace cooperation operation. Information sharing with Mexico has reached unprecedented levels. The Mexicans are sharing information about transnational criminal organizations, and we are sharing our experiences in asymmetric conflict to include intelligence-driven operations, whole-of-government solutions, and rule-of-law challenges. In turn, Mexico is increasingly reaching out to Guatemala, to Belize officials, in an effort to stem the cross-border traffic or flow of illicit activity. Canada and Colombia are reaching out to countries on a bilateral basis and in collaboration with the United States to coordinate the development and delivery of such defense cooperation. Just last week, as I mentioned, I visited El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, where the Southcom exercise Beyond the Horizon is taking place. The focus there on strengthening communities and preparing to respond to natural disasters is not only pertinent to those countries, but directly supports the type of non-traditional defense support that militaries are being asked to provide and should inform and validate the need for proposals such as the Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Proposal before the CDMA. The common thread that links all of the activities and programs, trainings and exercises is that they all strengthen partnership. That is our focus. And it is with the purpose or objective of furthering capacities, where those capacities are humanitarian, civilian, counter-drug, institutional, operational, strategic in nature, and that contribute to our partners' ability to export their unique skills and lessons throughout the hemisphere, and I would argue beyond. This is the type of activity that the United States will continue to support, and these are the areas in which we believe the multilateral defense institutions can play a more supportive role in the system, in supporting the system. Now, what we don't do, or what does this not mean? For the very legitimate reasons or activities I just mentioned, we need to challenge the assumptions and assertions that our defense cooperation is militarizing anything. Our foreign policy or our approach to citizen security is not about militarization, as I mentioned in the previous event that Jay sponsored here at INSS. This term ignores the focus and goals of our cooperation, which is aimed more squarely at supporting democratic institutions and insisting through each mission strict professionalism and respect for human rights, the rule of law, and of course, civilian authority. There are limits, though, to what the United States or other members will support in the system, and we need to be clear about the way in which we choose to partner. First, leaders must be careful to avoid relying on their defense institutions as the last providers of security. Second, military forces cannot be all institutions to all people. In other words, a professional force should not be trained and capable of dealing with, or should be trained and capable of dealing with civilian populations in a respectful and professional way, because their involvement in conducting or supporting basic public safety is a reality. Human rights and democratic practices are more important now as they engage in their activities than when they were engaged in traditional military missions. These missions, however, we believe should be short-term and temporary. These cannot be long-term solutions to the security problems of the region. We hear too often about forces being asked to assume new missions without adequate resources or training. That's a recipe for disaster. Similarly, we cannot expect our militaries to assume the responsibilities for social institutions. Soldiers are not substitute for teachers, not substitute for parents or medical clinicians or others. Strong law enforcement and development institutions are critical, but separate components of any comprehensive approach. Finally, military forces must remain apolitical and fully subordinate to civilian authority. Just as the chief security threats in the region no longer arise from right-wing paramilitaries or left-wing insurgents or Cold War powers intent on waging some geopolitical battles, so too must defense institutions avoid becoming politicized. And in some of these missions, that is a danger. I believe this is the norm in today's system, but weakening relationships between some militaries and their civilian leadership suggests this norm is not fully universal, and it is a cause of concern. In closing, I see a strong defense system of cooperation aimed at addressing the challenges, the very complex challenges of the 21st century. I see the foundations of this system in the multilateral defense institutions evolving to support the very system that created them. I see members of the system increasingly reaching out beyond their borders in a collaborative and constructive way to advance peace and security in the hemisphere and beyond. The reality is the system is strong. I see a multilateral, cooperative, inter-American capacity building effort that is daily, gradually, but certainly moving forward, reinforcing this trend. Now, we have a choice, though, in our collective vision for the future of our system. The institutions that provide this foundation and the missions of our forces must continue the path towards institutionalization and legitimization. I believe they can and should play an even more constructive role in facilitating this expanding dialogue and continue sharing information and best practices on topics that affect each member of the system. And I believe that this colloquium is an important contribution, conceptual contribution to that effort. To close with guidance from the Secretary, The United States, he said, must reinvigorate and will reinvigorate our defense partnerships in the region. This will be our choice over the coming months and at the CDMA in October. We look forward to working with our partners who see value in strengthening the inter-American defense system and who believe there remains a value in supporting strong multilateral defense institutions. I will admit there is still no consensus, no unanimity in the hemisphere with respect to advancing and strengthening multilateral defense institutions. But it is the only mechanism we have at the hemispheric level to achieve those goals and objectives. Again, Jay, Luigi, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for putting this very important colloquium together. I look forward to sticking around and listening to some of the discussion and some of the thoughts. I appreciate your assistance here, and I look forward to talking to all of you. Thank you very much. I'm always happy to take questions.
So the floor is yours. We have microphone people, and we will get to you so that everyone can hear the question. Wanted to manage your own question.
You got it.
Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the lecture, for the great explanation you have given us. I want to ask you if you see in all these threats in the future for the Western Hemisphere, some coming out of the Western Hemisphere, like for example, like Iran, the threats are coming from Iran in the strategic and tactical alliance that they are developing with Venezuela, especially in the Andean region, no? That will be my question.
I think with regard to Iran, we're always going to be concerned. Unlike, for example, India or China that provide benefit to the region, economic benefit to the region, I see no economic benefit or objective coming from Iran's engagement in the region. So it is a concern that we monitor very closely, both particularly from a non-state perspective. So the possibility is there, but it is still not one that I think emanates from a state threat to the United States coming from the hemisphere in alliance with Iran, for example. That's not the challenge that we foresee. We see a different, more asymmetric, perhaps, challenges, but the one that is still, I think, in many ways, developing.
Thank you, sir. Bob Pellegrin, U.S. Army South. Sir, can you opine to reference your vision as to the Conference of American Armies or Navies or Air Forces, what their role would be in your vision?
Yeah, I apologize for not mentioning them. It wasn't anything, it was more time. But I think these fora, and I mentioned fora, like the CDMA, but there are many others that I mentioned, and you've just described a few, that the whole proposal, for example, of humanitarian disaster response really started in the Conference of the Armies. That's where the genesis was born there, and it was taken to the ministerial level to see if we can, in a more concrete, tangible way, come up with a hemispheric mechanism. So these, I think, are important opportunities beyond the confidence building, I think, that they provide. I think there are actionable things that are occurring in some of these conferences, and and General Thibault can talk about this, but the idea here is that these conferences be linked together and that the board be an important fora for integrating, sharing information about what's going on in each of these conferences. One of the things that I have found is that sometimes they're disjointed, and it would be good if we had found a way to integrate them, and I think the board can play that particular role. Margaret.
In the interest of your time, I think maybe just one more question.
Okay.
Oh, dear. Frank, one of the challenges of multidimensional security is that it calls for coordination across multiple institutions of government. We're asking our partners, obviously, to do that in the region. Can you address how we are working to cooperate more effectively at the interagency level in this multidimensional security cooperation?
If I understand your question correctly, Margaret, I think obviously our country teams are critical. Our country teams are interagency entities, right? The issue then becomes not the interagency in one particular country, but how do we link embassies in the region? That's a challenge, but I think it's an important one, and that there's been, I could say, quite a bit of discussion in the interagency about how do we not just do a better job of integrating ourselves here in Washington, but how do we do a better job of integrating ourselves in the region? It's a work in progress, but I think we have no other choice. I mean, that is the solution. We are in new territory here, right? We are seeking to develop mechanisms of coordination that we have not done in the past, certainly not in this region. And so that's not something that could just happen overnight. There are some structural challenges, but I think conceptually we have made the leap and are trying to find ways to better do that. Not just within our interagency, but how does our interagency work with their interagency? And I think the best example of that is the SICA-CARSI process, where one of the pillars sort of underscores that particular piece.
Frank, I would love to keep you longer, but we know that your schedule is a little tight this morning. Would you please join me again in thanking Frank for being with us and so successfully launching us. Thank you very, very much. Before he slips out, we've got a 20-minute break, so listen for the cowbell. We'll see you back here in 20 minutes.